Hi, my name is Rick McCauley. Welcome to Photo Essay. We're putting together here a series of 12 shows about photography and the photographers behind the photographs. With us here today to talk about the history of photography and its impact on society is Michael Carelbach, University of Miami Associate Professor of Photojournalism and Journalism Communications. Michael, there's a whole history of photography, 150 years so far since the development. What kind of overall impact has that made to our society? I mean, life before photography had to be a totally different thing.
Well, it was different. Photography changed the world, Rick. It was never the same after 1839 and Daguerre made his first pictures in Paris. What photography did was brought the outside world to every man. Suddenly, anybody, anywhere, could have a picture of, say, the president or the king, of a pyramid in Egypt. It brought the whole world onto small rectangular bits of metal or paper and distributed them to everyone. In journalism, the photograph was perceived as real fact. The idea that photographs never lie really happened with the first pictures. Mm-hmm. These things were perceived as absolute truth. They still are, even though most of us now secretly know that all photographs aren't all truthful. The public still believes them.
Right. Now, you've brought along with you today a few slides to kind of show us a brief history. Now, I know 150 years of photography is kind of hard to squeeze into a half-hour show, but you brought like a collection of photographs basically dealing with the photojournalistic aspect of over time.
Yeah, what I've done is I've brought mostly news photographs.
Okay.
This first picture by a man named Daguerre, a Frenchman, showed a busy Parisian street with nobody on it. It took so long to get pictures back in the 1830s and 1840s that sometimes not everything that you got on the picture was exactly what you saw in the first place. But the detail that you got was extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And people back then really began to believe photographs, absolutely believe them implicitly. Everything about it seemed truthful and accurate, and people began to rely on photographs for evidence, for news, to see what was going on. Lincoln used photographs constantly in both his run for the nomination and then for the election. Right. He saw the value of pictures. This picture that Matthew Brady took, called the Cooper Union photograph, was used by Lincoln all during the campaign, passed out at train stations and things like that. And it persuaded people that this guy was not half alligator, half mule, that he was for real, that he was a statesman. The picture showed that.
So people at the time only had access to them if they saw them in person, then.
Absolutely. They would see, yeah, but you see...
But this changed the whole face.
It changed everything. Before the photograph, only the rich could afford a painted portrait of somebody. Right. But now, everybody could suddenly see a burning mill, for instance, near Boston, or see Indians come to visit the president in Washington. All of these things suddenly were magically brought home, many times by this man, Matthew Brady, who was the country's leading photographer and really the first true photojournalist in the country. When Civil War broke out in 1860, he was there. He went to Lincoln and he said, "I want to cover it." And during the first battles at Bull Run, and he was there. In 1861, 1862, 1863. He sent photographers all over the country, teams of photographers, to take pictures of the war, of the fighting, of the generals.
Every photograph that was credited to Matthew Brady, there were a lot that were taken by his team, I guess.
Oh yeah, most of them. In fact, some people say that he didn't take a single picture during the war, that he was half blind by then. But it was like working for the AP now.
Right.
You simply, you just worked anonymously.
Sure.
But still, it was the photograph. This is a picture of President Tyler. Suddenly, somebody could actually see the president. And you could see exactly how big Tyler's nose was. I mean, there were rumors about the size of his nose. And here's photographic evidence. I mean, he really had a beak. Now, this is the father of photography in America, and a man who's most known for Morse code, the inventor of the telegraph. He was also the first photographer in the country. He had met Daguerre in Paris and brought back the picture. This is a photograph that ran in a book back then. This is the poet Emily Dickinson in Amherst, Massachusetts. Everybody began to get pictures made. I mean, pictures were suddenly, it just transformed everything. You wanted to see what the prince looked like, the Prince of England looked like. Here's a picture of him and his retinue. Americans back in the 1850s were just as berserko about English royalty as they are today. And when the prince came to America, the whole country went crazy, and Brady was there to make a picture.
So Lady Di wasn't the first?
No, no, no. When the Japanese came to America,
sure.
Americans wanted to see what these strange people looked like. Again, Brady was there.
So it sort of closed the gap of the entire world here of distances.
Absolutely. It brought everything home, especially war. Between 1861 and 1865, when the nation was torn apart, Brady sent his photographers into the field, and they brought back the most extraordinary images of war, of a field hospital in Virginia, of captured Confederate soldiers at Gettysburg. I love this picture. I mean, they all look like Clint Eastwood to me. And that's the real stuff. Those are real prisoners. Those are real rebel soldiers.
So this is not the movies of today when we see the...
that's the real stuff.
The real thing.
And people were just... they couldn't believe it. These pictures of the dead at Antietam were shown in New York and in a museum there, and people couldn't believe it. I mean, this was the real stuff of war. This was not romance. These were real bodies of real people, and it just changed everything suddenly. It brought the world home. You wanted to see what was going on in Virginia with Grant and his staff. There was a photographer there who made a picture.
Now, how were these photographs disseminated to the public?
In various ways. The picture newspapers at the time ran a lot of them. Brady made them available. Brady saw, that as one of his jobs. He also he mass-produced them in sort of photo factories, and you could buy a photograph the way you buy baseball cards today. So people would keep these photographs and compile albums of their favorite Americans, photographs were very important. This photograph, a stereo card, which is one of the ways that photographs were mass-produced. They were put in a sort of a viewer, and you could see it 3D, of a dead Confederate soldier, a barefoot kid. He looks like he's about 13 years old, in the trenches at Petersburg, Virginia. These pictures had an enormous impact, just extraordinary impact. A dead rebel soldier
now, was
in Virginia.
Access to these images available to the North as well as the South?
It wasn't so much in the South, which ran out of photographic paper, ran out of photographic materials very early in the war. After the war, they were made available in the South, but mostly that was a northern enterprise. After the war, the news photographers that had covered the fighting were looking around for something to cover. And the big story in the years after the war was the West. And they went west. this photograph by A.J. Russell, who was an Army photographer during the war. He went with the railroad, and he covered the building of the railroad, which was like the space race is today. I mean, it was the major technological movement in the country in the 19th century. And this moment of the meeting of the rails in Utah in 1869 was just as important for 19th century Americans as a landing on the moon was for us.
Okay, now the curious thing about this one photograph is this kind of illustrates the first uses of photography, or second uses of photography, as propaganda.
Yeah.
Most of the people involved in the railroad were of Chinese descent.
Yes,
right?
at least the ones coming from west to east were largely Chinese, but there are no Chinese people in this picture. Well, that was good old-fashioned American racism. It was there then, and it is today.
Right.
But the point about photography is that even 10, 20 years after it was invented, it was everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Here's this fellow out on the plains of Nebraska. He lives in a mud house. An itinerant photographer named Solomon Butcher comes along and says, "I'd like to photograph you in your house." He says, "No, not my house, but I went to a lot of trouble to get this Sears organ." And so they bring the organ outside and make a picture of it, and it's there. You wanted to see what an explorer, Western explorer, looked like. There was a photographer who made a picture of one, William Henry Jackson, and that became our image of what the Wild West looked like. The Wild West was first shown in pictures.
So this created the myth that now we sort of accept all these stereotypes of the Wild West being a fast-shooting, gunslinging sort of place.
Yeah, no. It was to an extent. There were a lot of guns out there, and it was a wild place. It was very exotic. There were huge sand dunes. This is actually a photographer's wagon there.
Wow.
Not a covered wagon. That's how you traveled around.
So he had his darkroom and everything along with it?
Everything there, and then the magazines did that with it.
So the only way to reproduce photographs at the time were to etch them?
Yeah, with wood engravings, usually. But the point is that there were always photographers around. I mean, out in the middle of nowhere. A vigilante group hangs 3 horse thieves. There's not one photographer, there are 2 photographers. And after this picture is made, one punches out the other because, that was their thing, And so it's a media event, this little hanging, this vigilante hanging. And what happened is that as these pictures were reproduced, they began to insinuate themselves into the American culture. And we began carrying them around sort of like DNA. I mean, they just became part of American culture. Our idea of the West is, to a large extent, a photographic idea.
So it's built up on these images over time.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
The capture of an Indian. This is Geronimo, who was the leader of the Chiricahua Apaches in Arizona. When he was finally captured, which was a major news story, there was naturally a photographer there.
Wow.
A guy named Camillus Fly, who was the local photographer in Tombstone, Arizona. And Fly was there, and he got the meeting with the general, and there's the Indian, that's a wizened little Indian kneeling down, and they made it. You wanted to see what an Indian village looked like? Well, here's one of the last great Plains Indian villages. This is real life. It isn't Hollywood.
No Cecil B. DeMille here.
And it was about to disappear when a guy named Graybill took this picture. It was on its way out. This was 1890 or 1891, just before or after the battle at Wounded Knee. And this is a picture of vanishing America. It was going. You wanted to see a picture of a shootout? This is it. This is as close as they could get. This is a souvenir card produced by a photographer in Minnesota.
Okay. You've got photographs here, though. The top is all people look alive, and then the bottom, if we show the next slide, we've got
Well, some of those
bullet holes
people
here.
are alive, and some of them actually aren't. These are the bad guys. The two guys in the middle are dead. The two guys down below are dead. If you couldn't get a picture of a bad guy while he was alive, you prop him up and take a picture of him when he's dead. You know, I mean, it sends a message.
Right.
Now, there was a movie made of this event a couple of years ago when the James Gang and the Younger Gang and a bunch of other people came into Minnesota. But that's the real stuff. That's the first stuff.
So in this world of docudramas, then this is where all this image and consciousness.
A bad guy. Another one, Ned Christie, half-breed Indian. When the sheriff finally got him, the local photographer was called, you know, set him up with a gun, take his picture. There he is alive, and the other one where he's dead. We always had these pictures. Custer was a photo hound. And when he went into the Black Hills looking for gold in 1874, he was told not to bring a photographer, but Custer wanted to be president, so he brought along a guy named Illingworth, and he made sure that Illingworth got a lot of pictures of him, and he made sure those pictures were distributed in the press, and so we have them. I mean, we have this photographic record of the winning of the West. It's all there. It's proof.
Now, people started using this proof, this matter-of-factness about photography, to do all kinds of things.
Yeah.
You can explain some of the different ways that photography was used. You know, from electing presidents to even changing economic ways.
Absolutely. When late in the century, in the beginning of the 20th century, when waves of immigrants came to this country, there were photographers there to record that, number one, and number two, to make pictures to change the way things were, the inner cities, the way things were at Ellis Island. There always seemed to be a photographer there to make a picture, to prove a point. You wanted to know what the financier J.P. Morgan looked like? There was a photographer there to make his picture, and in this picture it looks like the great banker is actually holding a knife. He wasn't. That's just his hand on the arm of the chair. This is Steichen's picture for Vanity Fair.
So it seems like photography created as many myths and legends
always.
as it told the truth.
Sure. Take a look at this picture that ran in the newspaper in Pittsburgh. It's called Confession. Probably a setup, but what a great picture. I mean, I hope it's real, but
a real situation, but maybe it was
maybe. You know, the gun is just too perfect. It's too perfect. It's just a great picture. In the 1930s, Americans needed to be told about the plight of the poorest third of the farm community: sharecroppers, migrant laborers, tenant farmers, people who were before the 1930s basically invisible. A man named Roy Stryker hired a bunch of photographers, sent them out across the country to get pictures of these invisible people in order that their lives could be made better. Dorothea Lange, one of the photographers, made this picture of a pea picker in California, and it became the symbol for Americans of the Great Depression. It still is. Pictures of ordinary life, ordinary people. Here's a picture. I mean, this is a great shot. Listening to the radio at home. You know, I mean, you want to know what a hairnet looks like? That lady's got one on. You know, he's reading the newspaper. She's knitting. It's just American life, real life. This is one of Walker Evans's pictures from the book "Let Us Now Praise Famous Men" that he did with James Agee. Picture of sharecroppers in Hale County, Alabama. And it's just an extraordinary human document.
So by documenting, was there a feeling that they would change the situation?
This was pure propaganda, but it was propaganda that was based on truthful images, not made up. These weren't lies, they were real pictures.
Right.
This is a real picture by Arthur Rothstein of a dust storm in Oklahoma. It's real stuff. But it was so telling. I mean, suddenly people in New York City or Miami could see what life was like out in Cimarron County, Oklahoma. And it changed everything. Photographs have a way of changing the world. Take a look at the Vietnam experience. From the beginning of the Vietnam experience, it seemed that still cameras were there recording important events. When an elderly monk burned himself to death on the streets of Saigon in 1963, there was a cameraman there for the AP to make that picture and bring it home to Americans.
So this started a whole century of bearing witness. Life magazine looked,
absolutely,
and the whole documentary style turned now into real journalism, daily stuff.
Every day. We want to see stuff like this. This is Ray Gore's picture for the Chicago Tribune.
Right.
I think one of the really great newspaper pictures that I've ever seen, a baseball shot, real life. And this picture, of course, which changed everything. It was taken during the Tet Offensive in January 1968 by Eddie Adams for the AP. And this picture was carried around by people in their heads, and it became the leading symbol of the Vietnam experience for millions of Americans. It changed everything. We looked at this man, Colonel Lone, assassinating a Viet Cong terrorist on the streets of Saigon, and suddenly the whole world changed. People who were maybe sitting on the fence about the war were suddenly persuaded one way or the other by this photograph, which curiously existed alongside of television footage.
Right,
but it's the still picture that everybody remembers.
Sure, because that one moment just embedded in your mind.
We also saw this moment on television. Bob Jackson's photograph of the killing of Oswald. This stuff is just embedded in our consciousness, and you can't escape it. It's you can't escape the open mouth of Oswald. This is
one of your photographs.
Yeah, this is one of my photographs of a lady being bugged by Nixon in 1972 in Los Angeles, as most of us were in 1972.
So photography even can foreshadow a bit to...
Yes, it can, and it can appreciate. This is my appreciation of a dive, a lady diver down in Key West. I think that she actually straightened out after this moment. But I mean, that's sort of a brief history of this medium. It's still going on. The curious thing is that in spite of television, in spite of videotape, in spite of everything, we still like still pictures. There's something about that single image that freezes a moment, that concretizes a situation, that is inescapable and that people like.
Now, the effect of photography as far as seeing so much violence, I mean, the war photographs, Matthew Brady's, starting that. What does that do to our sense of our ability to look at the real?
Well, I don't know. A lot of people are worried about it, suggesting that in some way we become inured to violence, to blood and guts, and that the ante keeps getting raised. I mean, what do we need to see now in order to turn us on? I don't know. I mean, almost daily we see pictures of death, of tragedy, of dismemberment, and it's like, who cares anymore? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's worrisome.
There's a lot of photographers today. I know Life and Look magazine aren't the way they used to be.
No.
Now today people are working, there's a lot of people working in documentary styles of photography to sort of capture historically different facets of our culture. What does that do? What kind of expression, where is that available? I mean, you have video documentaries, you have...
It's in the newspapers, Rick.
Right.
That's where it's happening. It still is. The daily newspaper is the greatest place to see great photography. We have great photographers here in Miami. They're all over the world, and that's where you see photographs today.
So the truth, the sense of truth and the matter-of-factness is still
still there. We still rely on it. When the Challenger went up and exploded, we still needed to see those pictures, the still images, not the moving images, the still images. We want to see it as proof, as evidence, a certificate of presence, Sontag calls it.
Now, we see so much people escapism. People want to go see the movies. They don't want to be faced with this blunt reality. And so you have the sexier newspapers, even USA Today and other ones, where photography is well lit. It's it's portraits more. It's well presented. It's the grittiness and the photography of New York Times or Life magazines is kind of changed.
But that's always been there. There have always been people who wanted to make pretty pictures instead of real pictures. I mean, even in Daguerre's time, that was true. But the fact is that there is a sizable part of the public that wants to see the real stuff, and there are photographers that are out there taking it, and there are journals and magazines and newspapers that will publish it. The USA Todays have always been around, and they always will be. That's fine. But there are those real things, and people find them, the real stuff.
The people who are really concerned about.
Sure.
Okay. And you're working on a book now, I understand, too. I'm
working on 2 books. One on the FSA in Florida, the photographs of the FSA group in Florida, and one on the history of early photojournalism in America, which has some of these pictures that we've just seen.
Well, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for being with us today. Photo Essay is a continuing series, and next show we'll have...